Okay, I make it just gone 12 o'clock, so there will no doubt be some more people joining as we go along, but let me welcome you to today's webinar. Can I also welcome and thank Neil Morrison. I'll get him to introduce himself in a second, but he'll be working with me because the idea of this webinar is not to show you lots of PowerPoint slides. We have one slide and one slide only. It's to generate some conversations about the real world, about how we can help our HR business partners step up to the plate. Just a few logistical issues at the beginning. We will be recording the webinar and we will be issuing post-meeting notes within 48 hours afterwards. Please, if you could put yourselves on mute. Feel free though to go off mute and ask questions. Also, please feel free to use the chat facility to ask questions. And I'll probably be calling on some other participants to contribute. Because as I say, this is an opportunity for us to have conversations, not to have a long presentation. We hosted a webinar right at the beginning of this, where we had Rebecca Homkis and Stephen Bungay talk to us about, right at the beginning, about 3 phases. And Rachel, maybe in the chat, if you could put in the link to post-meeting notes. So it gives everybody a chance. Please obviously don't click on them now and read them now, which is what I'd probably do. But it gives you a chance to go back to what they said. But in summary, their core message was there are 3 phases. At the moment, we need to survive. We need to really focus on helping the business survive a crisis. But there will come a time when we need to reset. And what they meant by that was to reset their future strategy. Because I don't know in the organizations, Neil, I'd be interested to hear your view as a utility, but in most organizations, we have to reset our strategy because all the assumptions, all the forecasts on which we're basing our assumptions have gone out of the window. And then we'll move into the thrive phase. So having talked at the beginning about survive, today we're going to really think about the reset and the thrive phase. And what I'd like to do is just share my one slide with you. This is a slide based on a study by McKinsey that looked at the past recession, and they identified a number of organizations that are called the resilience. And what the resilience did was back in 2007-8, they cut hard and fast. They reacted immediately to the recession and they made the tough calls. But at the same time, what differentiated them was they immediately began to invest. Even though they were cutting costs in some areas, they were heavily reinvesting in this reset to think about future strategies and invest in them. And the thing that's fascinating is you look at this one chart, they outperformed the stock market by 40% over the next few years. So thanks, Rachel, if we just pop it back onto the share screen. And that, to us, is the lesson. And I am really proud to have worked in HR over the last few months. I've been blown away by the speed and quality of how the majority of people in the function have reacted to this survive phase. And the first thing I'd like to do is really go to Neil, let you introduce yourself quickly, but we need to learn from these things. We all make mistakes and never waste a good crisis. There's an opportunity here to learn. So Neil, what have you learned over the last few weeks?
Thanks, Nick. So just very quickly, my name's Neil Morrison. I'm the Director of HR for Severn Trent, which is a FTSE 100 utility business. I think the things that have really impressed me over the last few weeks that I've seen in teams is, one, nobody was expecting the speed by which we had to make decisions. And that real agility and ability to navigate a changing scenario very, very quickly and to make good situationally based decisions. Not necessarily coming from a playbook or for a set of policies or procedures, but really being able to look at the circumstances that we're in and what we needed to do. I think the second thing has been that real focus on the individual. One of the things that I think I'm most proud of over the last few weeks is that the way that we've started to understand the impact on individuals of the pandemic. Nobody has experienced this in the same way. So, whether you're a key worker, whether you're not a key worker, whether you were furloughed, whether you weren't furloughed, whether you're vulnerable, whether you were shielding, for example, that ability to identify individual needs and be able to adapt to meet those, I think has been fantastic. And then the final piece has been really to identify, which I think is kind of pertinent to where we're going to perhaps go in the conversation, identify those things that need solving right here, right now, those things that need solving in a week or 2 weeks, those things that we can't even solve because we just don't know the answer right now. And that kind of triaging of decisions, I think, was really quite impressive. And I've seen this across a lot of organisations, that ability to be able to focus on the 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, and be able to separate what do we need to be looking at right now.
Thanks very much for that. I think particularly I'd pick up your first point that HR is context specific. And I think too often we drive HR out of an HR mindset, whereas most of that mindset isn't going to be relevant, hasn't been relevant in the last few weeks. And that agility and the ability to pivot. And yes, we were doing this yesterday, but the context has changed. We don't just keep on doing it. Maybe a second question around this is, what are your observations about your HR business partners? Because obviously this whole session is aimed at HR, but it's very specifically helping our HR business partners with the reset. But what are some of your observations about your best HR business partners, no names, what differentiates them? What have you observed about them?
Yeah, so I think when things are moving quickly, and when you have to have that responsiveness and that kind of agility, for me, that's where business partners come into their own. So they have to, one, understand the business areas. So really, what am I dealing with? What are we here to do? What are we here to deliver? And how do I support the teams that I'm working with in order to do that? How do I support the leader in those areas? So, what's their emotional framework? What are they going through? What do they need to, where do they need support? Where do they need challenge? Where do they need an arm around the shoulder? Where do they need some coaching? Where do they need a stern word and to be told to go and take a good hard look at themselves in the mirror? The ability to deal with ambiguity. I think the best business partners are those that can do that can hold the ambiguity themselves when everybody else around them is feeling that sense of discomfort and is looking to someone for a level of certainty. They can hold that ambiguity. They don't just reflect it back onto people. And I think that's really quite key in then helping those business leaders and business areas to navigate out of it. And ultimately, I think, it's also the ability to be at 100 miles high one moment and then about an inch off the ground the next, and know where the right level is to be and which moment I need to be in which level. So I'm not talking big strategic challenges to a leader who actually just needs to know a specific answer to a question right now, but also I know when the right time is to step away from that detail and start to coach that leader through to say, well, hang on a second, are we looking at this in a systemic sense or approach, or are you just getting too focused on the operation right now?
Brilliant. I'd really like your first point about understanding with whoever you're partnering with what is appropriate. That sometimes actually, and one of my observations, being a leader at the moment must be an incredibly tough, lonely place to be for them personally. Forget the commercial aspects. They're having to go through all the same things we're all going through, and being there as their confidant to support them, but also, as you said, being willing to challenge them, to push them a little bit harder. I remember Hugh Mitchell, who was the group HR director at Shell, he talked about HR with attitude. Your job is not to be liked. Your job is to support the organization. Can I ask Caroline Thomas, I think you're on, because Andy Moat took part in the first webinar. Caroline, could you possibly share in your organisation, again, if you could just introduce yourself quickly, what have you observed over the last few weeks since we spoke last time?
Yes, of course. Hi, I'm Caroline and I'm the Director of HR at B&Q. And I suppose the things that we have observed is that change in leadership mindset, and how we can be a lot more agile in terms of the way that we're working. So some good examples would be that as a leadership team, we've recognised that actually kind of the reduction of our middle management team during the process of being on furlough actually meant that we got to some root cause problems far quicker than previously. We was able to communicate far quicker than previously before, and we had a kind of a mindset that is just good enough. Actually, we're very good at being perfectionists at B&Q, and nothing could get delivered unless it was 100% right. And I suppose a really good example of that would be our store-to-home delivery operation, where we've been talking about that operation for about 18 months. And it took the crisis for us to have that in place within 4 weeks. A new operating model, new processes, and do you know what? It isn't perfect, and yes, our HR team are now running around kind of making sure that all the new drivers, because we've never had drivers before, have got a proper induction, and all the training materials are all in place, and we recruited the right people and we've got the right checks. But we were agile, and that business now takes about £10 million a week. From when it was taking nothing previously before. And so I think what we've realised as a leadership team is actually we stop ourselves, we try to make things far too perfect. We give ourselves too many challenges, or we accept too much challenge, or we accept too many questions, when actually we just need to go with our gut a little bit more and go with our instinct. And accept that failures are going to happen, but we fail fast and we move on quickly. And for us as a leadership team, we've definitely been thinking about, now that we've brought, so as of today, all of our head office teams are now back at work. And it's how do we take that team on that journey with us? So in our head office, we have about 900 people, and during the crisis, we went down to 300 people. But the business still kept going, it still kept moving, and we transformed in that time as well. So how do you take them on that journey, being mindful that it wasn't in spite of them, but it was because of the crisis? And that's been a real kind of leadership struggle for us during that time, in terms of making sure we take them on the journey. So we've created a journey map as a whole organisation. And then for each of the functions, we've created a functional journey map, so they can be brought on that mindset, and then we work with them over the coming weeks in terms of to engage them back into the workplace and engage them into the new ways of working. So we have shorter, smaller meetings, less people in meetings. We make sure that when we have a meeting, is the decision maker in the room, and if you're not, then you don't need to be here. So it's those kind of things that we're trying to call each other out on, but lots to learn that we have learned.
Brilliant, thanks. And again, I see a real link with this thing about this need for agility, the need to deal with ambiguity, because it is different. And by the way, shortly after you reopen, I bought some grass seed and I had a great service. So
amazing. That's what we love to hear.
So we talked about survive, and I think it's important that we learn the lessons from that. But the whole point about that first webinar is we need to think of reset. And I think that, we are in the middle of that, well into that, this need to think about the changing environment and the capability we need to build. We obviously run an HR business partner program. We always start at the beginning by talking about the purpose of HR, which is not to do HR stuff, to build the capability of an organization to deliver its strategy. And of course, the strategy is changing. And I guess, Neil, the challenge for us is, sometimes in HR we can be short-term operationally focused, but I think a lot of line managers can be short-term operationally focused. So again, you talked about the need to challenge. How have you and your HR business partners been challenging your leaders to think long-term, to think outside in and future back, rather than what do I do today to survive the crisis?
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I think in some ways, one of the analogies I've used over time is that strategy's traditionally been a bit like an oil tanker. You'd set your course, you'd go, you'd plot it for 10 years, for example, 5 years, and you'd just be on that one direction going straight forward. And in some ways, what we're ending up with is something that's more akin to a surfer. So someone who's constantly looking at the environment that they're in, trying to identify the opportunity and trying to then respond to it and to make the most of those circumstances. But they always have a core aim in mind. And I guess that's in some ways how we try to work with our managers, which is around, we understand where we're trying to get to. We understand the broader purpose and the broader sense. But our job isn't just to push them down one line. Our job is to see the opportunity to be able to encourage them, or when there's the right moment or the right environment, to help push the organisation towards that. Being a line manager is really tricky. You've got a lot of things that are on your plate. You've got so much coming through quite a narrow bandwidth. And the last thing you need is an HR business partner saying, and here's another 10 things that you need to do. You want someone to help you navigate through that in the best possible way. And in order to do that, you've got to go to where the manager's at and then help them from that position. And some of that is push, some of it is pull, some of it is challenge, some of it's encouragement. But it's got to be presented in a way that makes sense to the individual that you're talking to in the context that they're dealing with. They'd say something like, I don't know the exact number, but it takes 8 presentations of a different flavour to a baby before they accept it as a food. And in some ways, when you're trying to encourage people down a path of change or response or a different strategic direction, sometimes you've got to represent things a few times and just get the right environment and the right response to it. And I think if in some ways, we're guilty as a profession of doing things, it can either be to think things up in isolation and then try and force them through the line and get frustrated when they don't go. Or alternatively, we just do what the line wants and we get it. And I think this is particularly pertinent for business partners. You get a great sense of reward from that because the person you're partnering says they're absolutely amazing. But actually, we have to be in service of something else. We're not in service of just doing what that manager wants. We've got to be in service of creating the highest performing organisation, highest performing teams, and the highest performing individuals that we can in the context that we're operating in.
And just to pick up on that, I think that it's a great point that the danger as an HR business partner sees their role as working with that line manager. And the danger is they take this very siloed approach. And I think as HR, we are one of the very few transversal functions that we operate. We might be working within a business unit, but we're operating on behalf of the whole enterprise. And it's an interest, again, you talked about ambiguity, because you can't alienate the business unit you're working with. But if they're doing something that's not in the interests of the whole enterprise. By the way, I'd encourage everybody, if there are questions that are coming out of what we're talking about, or if they're just observations and contributions you want to make, please feel free to use the chat facility to contribute. And again, I'd like to call Vicky Osborne. Maybe if you have any thoughts again of how you work at that enterprise level and how you challenge your business leaders to think long term when they're short term focused.
Yeah, I mean, that's been sort of a sort of 15-year struggle to some degree, because we get our immediate gratification from helping people and being told we're doing a good job because we've done something that helps them immediately. But actually, as you were referring to just before, it doesn't really help the long-term piece in the organisation. Really, so a lot of the behaviour around that is I think, dependent on having something that gives a common purpose towards which people can align around. And that's the way you can then help focus, HR business partners and our managers on thinking about the longer term and our overall purpose as a whole enterprise, rather than just the singular business unit. Because it's quite a systemic piece. So really, you're trying to challenge regional thinking versus enterprise-wide thinking, and you haven't really got a catalyst on which to do that, because you're going to be fighting sort of or battling against an oncoming wind, really. So I think actually trying to find something where there is a common purpose, where you are really attaching the motivation to change mindset to something that brings about, it might be a delayed gratification for that person, but actually where they can see something in it for them, that's where you're going to get a bit of traction about moving. But you just have to paint that vision and keep talking about that sort of collective story, really.
Brilliant, thanks. And I think you highlight a couple of interesting things here, that in our experience, one of the most important characteristics of a good HR business partner is to have enough self-confidence and enough courage to take themselves out of the equation. And if I'm honest, sometimes in my earlier career, I was a little bit needy. I liked that positive reinforcement, and it didn't do me any good. And again, on the HR business partner program, we run a little simulation where you have to work with a leadership team, and it's all about having the political skills to know when to intervene, because it's no good talking to a line manager about something long-term and strategic if their headspace isn't in the right place. And Neil, maybe again, could you share how do you and how do your good business partners deal with that ability to be opportunistic and pick the right moment without slipping back into just saying the nice things and you're doing a good job and thank you?
So I think some of it is starting from a position of trust. So I think one of the key things in terms of the business partners is building up the trust that allows them to challenge, so that it isn't seen as being provocative, so it isn't seen as being disruptive, difficult. And we talk about this model of kind of authenticity, empathy, and logic are the key things to building trust. So, I need to see you as a whole person. I need to think that you empathise with my situation, and I also need to trust that you logically can think through where I am. And when that trust is there, I think it then allows the business partner to push at those right moments. And I often say to my teams, it doesn't matter if you fall out with the people you're partnering with, if you can make back up with them thereafter. You need to be able to put a little bit of grit into the oyster, if you like, in order to get that pearl. It can't just be around constantly harmonious situations. But you can't do that unless you've got the trust. And that trust, as I say, is built by understanding where the individual is. So all of us will have been in circumstances where someone's tried to get us to do something and it just isn't at the right time. And so we reject it because of the situation, not because of the idea itself. And so that situational awareness is really, really critical. And what I see within the team who are really good at it, they'll say, not today. It's just not today. I'll come back to it tomorrow. And even if that's they've gone into a meeting to talk about a particular situation, or it would be a Teams call at the moment, or whatever it is, and we'll back out of it because they'll say they're just not in the right headspace. Alternatively, they'll also push on ideas at a time when they haven't planned it through, because they can suddenly see that the conversation is going in that right direction. And therefore it is that anticipation of being able to respond to the environment and seeing you know, where the person that you're partnering with, where they're at. And you know, personally, I mean, you never stop partnering, do you? Because I mean, I work with the CEO and I work with the board, and you know, at the same time, I'm trying to get them to move in certain directions. And you will start by questions, just saying things like, "How are you? You know, what's going on?" Because all of that data then helps you to understand, you know, is this going to be a moment to push things a little bit further, or is this a moment where I just go low and simple and easy and walk away with that, and that's okay. And so I think one of the skills that builds up over time is, as I say, is that situational awareness and judgment, and the understanding of the emotional state of the person that you're trying to influence will be as important as the idea that you've got itself, and not allowing an idea that is generally the right thing for the business and the right thing for the performance to be rejected just because of the basis that you landed it at the wrong time. Both things have to be in play.
And again, I think there's a couple of interesting points there. One is the trust element. And I'm going to remind you all of a different time. About a year ago, we actually ran a face-to-face meeting. We were all in the same room together. I don't know if any of you remember that, but we talked about the concept of the trusted advisor. And what we'll do is, in the post-meeting notes, we'll put in some of the resources from that, because I think what you're saying, and we agree at CRF, trust is everything. I remember talking to one business partner who had spent her whole life in a corporate head office role, and she was now out in the country, and she was very aware that she had a global transversal role. But she said, when I first started, I worked very, very closely on the agenda of that country, because if I came in and just taught group initiatives all the time, I would never have built the personal trust. So she started off being very much in the local, but she said all the time she was shifting back to thinking about the group. Maybe could I ask Simon Clements from BTS to share, because obviously you work with leaders. Do you have any sort of hints and tips of how HR business partners can work with their leaders to pick, you know, to be situationally aware, to have the antennae to pick up? Is there any sort of insights that you could share with us? Maybe it's a connection issue. We'll try and come back to Simon a little bit later. You know, again, it's this whole ability to sense what's going on, and again, to have the patience that you go into the meeting and you have an agenda, but within a minute you work out it's not the right moment. And if you just push when the other person doesn't want to. Again, in terms of thinking long term and getting this reset, I guess one of the key things is it's important to be thinking about not just HR, but the business. And how do you get your HR business partners to think outside HR, outside the business? What do you get them to do to have that real business focus?
Yes, so it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, you know, if I remember very early on when people said to me, you've got to get to know the business, I'd immediately go, oh, it's about commercial. It's about, you know, it's about the P&L, or it's about understanding the balance sheet, or and obviously that is some of it. But I think one of the biggest challenges for business partners is actually going out and understanding what it is like to work in the organisation, to really feel what the experience is for people in different departments, different functions. So not just the intellectual sense of what they're trying to achieve, or a model of how it looks on an end-to-end kind of product line or model, but really what's the experience like and what's the feeling like? And the only way you can really do that is by going out and talking to people and absorbing that data. You know, if you're looking for mastery of any topic, there is obviously an intellectual part to it. You know, I need to read the annual reports. I need to understand what's coming out. I need to understand the projects that we're trying to deliver. But one of the things, as I say, that I'm really trying to instill in the teams is you've also got to go and understand, you know, in our world, what does it feel like for that meter reader, the person who's going out around the streets. And, particularly during coronavirus, this is a real challenge for us. What's it like going and doing that job? If you're producing, clean water from effluents that's coming out of people's houses, actually, what does it take to do that really, really well? And what is the organisation doing that helps that or hinders that? Because I think that data is really important to then feed back into the people that you're partnering with. Because quite often you can be the person that can be that critical friend and tell them the things that nobody else is telling them. You think that change initiative was absolutely brilliant and the CEO is giving you a big pat on the head, but everybody hates you, right? This is just not working and it's not delivering the results. That's the kind of data that's really important. That's what gives the business partner their place at the leadership table, rather than trying to outdo the finance business partner on understanding the P&L for last month, because that's someone else's job. So I think there is a sense of understanding your business, but understanding what your role is in translating that back, being eyes and ears, being the place that can safely challenge and translate that data back in a way that helps the performance cycle to improve. Not just simply stating numbers and facts that are randomly intellectually being picked up. You've got to be able to translate, I guess, interpret.
And I really like your point at the beginning. I'm running a bespoke program for an organisation with their HR team at the moment, and I asked a group a few days ago, when was the last time you'd met an end user, an end customer, not of HR but of the business? And it was kind of horrifying. The vast majority had never met an end user, and I think of going into B&Q that time. That is a very different environment to being in head office. And particularly, you talked about listening and feeling what's going on in the business. And, employee engagement is going to become an even more of a strategic driver. And I think we have a role not to have the employee engagement survey, but to be out there. And therefore, to think that HR can sit in an office in the headquarters. Now, the challenge is, how do you do that in this environment? But I think you can.
I think you have to, if I'm entirely honest, and I think, if you're talking about thriving, one of the things that I think we need to be doing right now is stopping our focus on what has just happened as a separate thing that we are managing or looking at outside of business as usual, and starting to roll all of that into business as usual. We are great at running incidents in my business. It's part of what we do because we provide critical national infrastructure, and therefore we need to be able to maintain that at any point in time. So we've gone through the current challenge quite well in that sense. That we're having a lot of conversations now saying, this has to become business as usual. We have to be talking about customer experience. We have to be talking about employee experience engagement. We have to be talking about, capital delivery programs in a new world, not saying there's this previous world that we'll get back to in some shape or form. And when we get back there, we'll do all of that activity again. It's right now, it's right here. And whether that's customer-facing interactions, as you're talking about, Nick, or whether it's employee interactions, or whether it's just the broader strategic direction of the business, it doesn't go on pause for 3 months just because there's a pandemic. It is still happening, and therefore we need to adapt our practice to take that into account.
I was going to ask Mike Frankel maybe from Engage, since you're experts in the field of engagement. What's your experience of how do we measure and how do we judge whether people are engaged when we're not in the same physical space as them?
So yeah, as you guys have said, it's definitely not the time just to have radio silence when it comes to things that, most organizations were doing before the crisis, as far as whether it's engagement pulse checks or a regular survey. However, also very important to still acknowledge, obviously that's the reality that people are going through, and to make sure you're asking the right questions to support people in whatever their unique circumstances are. May have touched on this in a previous session, but one thing we've seen especially is in the segmentation of the results. So asking people for things we've never asked about before, such as their living arrangements. Do they have children at home? Are they a carer? Do they personally, or do they live with someone who might be more at risk? Because we're seeing a lot more similarities with the needs of people within those groups, as opposed to traditional functional splits, or how long someone's been in the company. So I think the key points would be ask about it regularly, and then make sure you're segmenting what you're asking, so you're supporting people adequately, so you can understand where the issues may be lying and how you can best support people.
Thanks. And I think there are a couple of interesting insights in there, and it's repeating something from that first webinar when we were talking about this, of whilst, particularly in CRF, we believe that it's about the business, we are still the HR function. And one of the tips somebody said was, when you're talking with if you're a manager, you're talking to the team, the first question is, have you delivered what I asked you to deliver? The first question is, how are you? And I think particularly at the moment, as we start to talk about not returning to work, because we've been at work, but returning to an office, I think, being clear that if people have dependents, if they've gone through bereavement, we need to go beyond the commercial and really ask people. And again, Neil, what I've observed that differentiates great HR directors and great HR business partners, and you mentioned it, is that ability to ask the right question, to be the coach, not to tell, but to question. I remember Toby Payton-Jones, who's the HR director, I don't know if you know Toby, from Siemens. He told me a great story. He was working with his leadership team, and they were behaving in a quite dysfunctional way. And rather than tell them, he just asked them, if our direct reports are in the room watching us behave like this, what do you think they'd think? And it generated a massive debate. So could you talk a little bit more about you, and particularly your HR business partners' role of being coaches and asking the right questions?
Yes, so there's two things I'd put together. One is listening, and the other one is asking questions, asking great questions. And often I think we focus too much on asking the question and not enough listening. So we and the importance of that is that sometimes I think the best role for the HR business partner is listening to what isn't being said or what is being inferred by comments, particularly in meetings, and then being able to ask the questions to try and unearth those. So, very simply, and I'm actually at the moment downstairs, or I have been downstairs in the building that we're in with my executive team, and we're working on a couple of things together. And one of the things that we quite often hear is, people saying, what's on your mind? There's something there that you don't seem to be quite articulating, or what is it that worries you about that? So trying to get beneath the, if you like, the intellectual presentation of a problem into what actually is the fear or the anxiety or the emotion that's underneath that being presented. One of my observations around leadership and executive teams is so much of the conversations that they have are intellectualized, and therefore it's who can come up with the best intellectual argument for or against a thing. And you can waste a huge amount of time, whereas actually if you can get to the root cause of people's concerns, then you can start to unpack it a little bit and make progress a lot quicker. So many of us would have seen decisions at businesses kicked off where I just need to see another set of data, or I need you to go away and do another pack on that, or another paper on this, and we waste so much time, when actually if we understood what the issue was that was going on through good questioning and good listening, we could probably just get things done much quicker. So the two things kind of work together. And we talk about this, particularly within my partnering team, we talk about decisions are either endorsed or improved. So if something's coming to the table, you either endorse it or you improve it. You don't just slow it down. And I think some of that comes out of the ability to kind of work collectively and to coach each other as a group around discussion topics, rather than simply expecting it to be done by one person. But that's harder when you then go out into your business areas and your business teams. And so they are two incredibly important skills, but I would put them equally important. So you've got to be able to listen to the subtext in order to be able to ask the right questions. And I think it's dangerous to go in there with preemptive, presumptive, here's my 3 questions that I always ask. Nobody likes being badly coached, right? We've all experienced it from someone when you go, will you stop just coaching me now, please? So you don't do that if you're listening, and again, you've got that situational awareness. It's not your standard pattern.
And it's interesting because some people talk about the 5 whys. And I don't know about you, but if I was being coached and somebody just kept asking me, why for 5 times, I get rather annoyed. I think your other point about listening is really important. Again, when we run the simulation in the program, it's very interesting to see who is just inside their headspace and who is really listening to what's going on. In particular, I'd ask this maybe to everybody on the call, how often are you truly listening and how often are you waiting to speak? Because great HR business partners know the great question, but they listen. And as you say, Neil, they listen to the whole body. They're listening to everything that's going on. What I'd also like to do is pick up a couple of the points that are being raised in the questions. Sam, and I think it's being reinforced by Richard and by Vicky, is how do you see the role of the business partner evolving after COVID? Do you think this will take us forward, or will it be a setback back into business as usual?
I think, the worst answer to a question like that is it depends, but that's the answer you're going to get. I think it depends. I think it depends on the individuals in the business. There is no doubt that what we've just experienced has been a human crisis. So those of us who were leading organisations back in 2007, 2008, we went through a financial crisis. What we've just experienced has been, as I say, a human crisis. And that has impacted on people in very, very different ways in their organisations. And getting our businesses and our organisations to perform on the back of this is going to require real human understanding. And I think senior HR business partners, anyone actually within the people profession can play a substantial role in helping to deliver that. It's not just going to be in terms of the strategic issues, the kind of, the stuff that we all want to spend our time playing with. It's also going to be some of the smaller stuff. So, for example, coming into the office with a cold is going to be socially unacceptable for a very long period of time. Now, most of us would have made it socially unacceptable in our businesses to not come into the office with a cold. We're going to have a lot of these challenges that are just going to permeate through the way in which we run our organisations. And what I think HR leaders should be doing at any level within the organisation is helping the people that they partner with and their teams to navigate through all of that. We are going to see large swathes of the workforce become unemployed. We're going to see a different way in which we need to hire talent. We will see, a number of job applicants going up for vacancies. We're going to see reskilling being required. There's a whole range of challenges that we are centrally placed in order to help our organisations navigate through. But we'll only get the opportunity to do that if we can start to paint these pictures. We don't need to know the answers. And I think that's, and nor do we need to work on a project plan that takes 8 months in order to get to the answers. We just need to be starting to articulate that. And I think if we can do that, then we'll see the role of HR and the establishment of HR progress once again within organisations. But ultimately, it will depend on the business itself and the calibre of the individuals themselves, and whether they've got the courage, I think, to a certain extent, to try and embrace that opportunity, or whether we shy away from that or feel that we don't have the support to do so.
And I guess the couple of thoughts I have is people need to give deep thought to this, that, you know, practice makes perfect. I was watching a brilliant series on Netflix. What was it called? The Last Dance, about Michael Jordan. And what came out was he wasn't always the most gifted player, but he just practiced harder than anybody else. And I think with leaders like yourself and in teams of business partners, practicing some of these critical conversations is really important. Peter Blorston put a note earlier on chat that we've developed a toolkit within CRF. And again, in the post-meeting notes, we'll put a link to that. But I think it's really valuable to have a framework to think about how to have these conversations. You know, they are all different, but if you've got a series of approaches that you can think through, it can really help you think it through.
I think that's right. I mean, one of the things that I always find quite peculiar is we wouldn't expect a orchestra to go on stage and play without having practice. We wouldn't expect a sports team to go out without having practiced. They do that week in, week out, and then they perform. And yet when we're talking about leadership, or when we're talking about, you know, our ability to be able to influence people within the business, we kind of just expect everyone to turn up on a Monday morning or a Tuesday morning, or whatever it is, and turn it on right there. And I think, you know, these things are skilled. And what that means is you will get it wrong at times in the practice. You will get a bloodied nose. You know, we were talking about the right time to land kind of initiatives and change earlier. And sometimes you will get that wrong. And it will be painful because something that you're in love with, that you desperately think is the right thing to do, gets, you know, absolutely rejected by, you know, whether it's the CEO or the executive team or the organisation, because it's just landed at the wrong time. That happens, right? You've got to dust yourself down and go back again. And that is part of the practice. It's not then moving away from it and going to a safer space. And that's where the importance, I think, in organisations who are lucky enough to have HR teams, that's where you can establish that within the team, that kind of sense of support network and practice and safe space almost.
Yeah, I just pick up on your point at the beginning. I'm not sure about you, but I wouldn't like to be sitting just as we're about to take off and the pilot comes on and says, well, this is my first time in an aircraft and I was due to have some time in a simulator, but actually I've been a little bit busy. So I don't know about you. Let's see how this goes. Now, what do I press next? You know, and it astonishes me that, you know, these conversations that, as you say, are so critical and we haven't got the time to practice them. Could I maybe pick on Sam and Vicky, that you both asked the similar question? Maybe Sam first. You asked the question, do you have any thoughts about this?
About how we take the organisation on the journey and stop them from going back to where they were.
Exactly.
I think it's really hard because we're seeing in our organisation that there are different leaders who are at different places. So how you might have more of a traditional leader that wants to go back to the way things were, i.e. having people in the office, more presenteeism, that kind of culture. Whereas other leaders have actually learned through this experience that working remotely is a lot easier, still works, quite effective. And I think, to be very honest with you, we haven't got the answer to that. So that's why I was quite interested to see if there was any other tips that people are picking up or approaches that they're taking in their organisations.
What I'd encourage people to do is either come off mute and feel free to share, or share on the chat facility, because, you know, we've got a lot of people on the call, a lot of experience. I want to move on to one final question for Neil, and then we'll sort of open it up. I think one of the interesting challenges is too often HR business partners, we talked about this earlier, work with the people they like. or the people who share their passion. And sometimes they're not the real people. And I think what's going to happen with this reset is that the people that matter are going to change. So how do you make sure that your HR business partners aren't working with the people they've traditionally worked with, but working and thinking about who are going to be critical in the future for the organization?
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? And I think if I can just come back to the point, because I think it's interconnected about leaders being in different places. You know, one of the things that seems to be emerging from this is that the most successful leaders through this period of time are those that have higher levels of empathy and have been able to help. I was looking at some research just last week showing that they've been able to help organisations to navigate through, whereas those who've been particularly driven by IQ, if you like, rather than EQ over a period of time, have struggled because the rules of the game have entirely changed. One of the keys, I think, and we talk about this with our business partners, is building blended teams. And that's not about all going out and doing psychometric profiles and then looking at, you know, your MBTI style and what have you. It's understanding who brings a different lens into a decision-making situation, and often the people that you find the most difficult or the most, you know, hard to work with are difficult because they look at the world in a different way to you. And when we talk about truly inclusive organisations, that has to be an aspect of that. And so proactively identifying the people who look at situations, decisions, or the world, the team, the business in a different way is a fundamental part of what I think being a good practitioner is and a good business partner is. And so you just have to be mindful, constantly mindful of that. And I think you're right. I think that will be more so over the coming couple of years than it will necessarily have been in business as usual. It's much easier to run business as usual in consensus.
And Sharon's just made a great point that it is about us modeling that behavior. And to me, behavior is driven by mindset. And I think the real challenge in this environment is to shift your mindset from reacting to the current crisis and moving on to thinking about the reset. And could I call Joanna Sanders? What are some of your thoughts about switching from that reactive to that more proactive, future-oriented way of thinking in HR?
Okay, sure. So, I mean, it starts with that conversation for sure. And at Lloyd's Register, we are trying to now start to really look at that and think about future ways of working and those coming out of this crisis. And it's an interesting point around that, because I thought you might ask me about how we move to switch to this BAU. And I guess my reflection on that is, you know, that is so important, but also I guess there's still so many unknowns, and you know, there's still that risk of a second wave. So how much do we park it as a separate, and how, you know, how much do we integrate it? It's one to reflect on. But certainly thinking about, you know, where have we really thrived even during the crisis, and knowing that there's still lots of unknowns for the future, what are those habits that we really want to hardwire for the future so that we keep them? Because we know that we'll revert back to type otherwise if we don't have the right framework in place to really sort of keep that learning. So certainly I think our comms has changed. It's become a lot more agile, a lot more fluid. We've perhaps tried things without having all the answers that have worked, or that we've need to adjust. And you know, there's some real business benefit for that type of behaviour that we definitely want to keep for the future.
Brilliant, thanks. And I guess it takes us back to the one and only slide, that the organisations that have thrived since the last big crisis were the ones that learnt during that crisis and adjusted their behaviour. Coming up for full time, Neil, would you like to share a couple of final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my key sense of this is I think there is a massive opportunity for the HR profession that we've learnt a lot over the last 3 months that can help us to do things differently. But at the same time, we mustn't forget that we've also lost a lot. We've stopped doing a lot of things that are longer term going to be beneficial to our organisations, that we've been able to turn off in the short term without any criticality. And I guess as we look towards thriving in whatever the future holds, one of the big challenges is to blend those two pieces together, to be really clear about not putting stuff back in for the sake of it, but also not rejecting it just because we've learned this exciting new norm. And we have a real opportunity to step into a central role in defining the future performance of organisations in a way that many of us have fought to get to over the last sort of couple of decades. But the opportunity to be able to step into that now is very much there. And I guess I hope more and more organisations, including my own, will do that. And to turn what has been a pretty tricky experience into something that will hopefully be positive for the world of work for the next couple of decades.
And I guess in summary, I'd take that great quote from Gandhi and change it slightly and say, we should be the HR function we want to see. So can I thank Neil very, very much for his contributions? Can I thank everybody else who stepped in and contributed as well? As we said at the beginning, we will be having post-meeting notes. We'll be sending those out in the next 48 hours. And I hope you found this useful. And thank you very much, everybody, especially Neil, for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.